October 18, 1941. The carrier Lexington was steaming toward Oahu, her flight deck rolling in heavy seas. Ensign Robert Weinzapfel stood in Vulture's Row, watching his squadron mates launch for a Liberty weekend on Ford Island. He was grounded with an infected eardrum, the result of a head cold suffered during dive bombing practice. His prized Ford Model A convertible, bought for $45 in San Diego, was already on its way to Honolulu. It was the only car in his squadron, making him the most popular man in scouting too. By December 7th, the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor had shattered every peacetime routine. Weinzapfel's squadron, the Lexington Air Group, and the Yorktown Airmen were suddenly the front line of a war the Navy had not trained them to fight. The question was whether these green pilots, flying the rugged but untested SBD Dauntless, could rise to meet an enemy that had just destroyed the Pacific Fleet. 2 days after the attack on December 9th, Weinzapfel was cleared for flight and sent up on a routine patrol. Returning to the carrier, he received a wave-off from the landing signal officer. His SBD stalled at low altitude, spun, and slammed into the ocean nose first. The force of the impact knocked him unconscious. His rear gunner, Raymond Reams, kicked free of the sinking wreckage and watched the tail section rise briefly before plunging under the waves. Weinzapfel never escaped the cockpit. That night, his best friend and roommate, Ensign Jack Lepla, wrote to the family in Winster, Texas. "Robert was like a brother to me," Lepla wrote. "His courage was well known, and he had no fear of death. It was the first loss Scouting II had to absorb, and it would not be the last." On February 1st, 1942, the Yorktown Air Group launched the first American offensive strikes of the war. Lieutenant Commander William Birch led his scouting 5 SBDs against Japanese shipping at Macon Island in the Gilberts. Behind him flew Lieutenant Bernie Strong. In Birch's rear seat rode aviation radio man First Class Willard Glidewell, a 12-year Navy veteran and former amateur boxer known to everyone as an unflinching gunner. One of Birch's wingmen was Lieutenant Junior Grade Stanley Vetasa, a blonde-haired Montana farm boy who had never fired a gun in anger. The dive bombers hit the seaplane tender Nagata Maru and set her afire. They destroyed 2 big Kawanishi flying boats anchored in the lagoon, but nearly every pilot struggled with a problem that would plague them for months. Their windshields and telescopic sights fogged over completely when diving from cold, high altitude into the warm, humid air below. They aimed by sticking their heads out of the cockpit and looking down the side of their planes. The bombs hit, but not as squarely as they should have. By March 10th, the Lexington and Yorktown air groups were ready to strike together. They launched from the Gulf of Papua, flew over the 13,000-foot Owen Stanley Range through a narrow mountain pass, and dropped on Japanese shipping at Lae and Salamaua on the New Guinea coast. Lieutenant Commander Robert Dixon led his scouting 2 SBDs down on the armed merchant cruiser Congo Maru and the transports off the wharves. Jack Lepla, flying tail end Charlie, planted a direct hit on one transport. The raid sank 4 Japanese ships and damaged half a dozen more. It was the first successful combined carrier strike of the war, and it bought the Allies a precious month before the enemy could resume his advance on Port Moresby. The early losses had been real and painful, but the men who survived those first months were no longer green. They were learning to fight, to navigate through weather that blinded them, and to place their bombs where they counted. By early May 1942, the Yorktown and Lexington air groups had been at sea for weeks, operating in the Coral Sea. On the morning of May 4th, Admiral Fletcher ordered a strike against Japanese shipping at Tulagi, a tiny island just north of Guadalcanal. Lieutenant Commander William Birch led his scouting 5 SBDs off the deck at dawn, each carrying a 1,000-pound bomb. The pilots found a harbor packed with enemy ships, destroyers, transports, and the mine layer Okinoshima all riding at anchor. But as the Dauntlesses pushed over into their dives, the same old problem returned: fogged windshields and telescopic sights, completely blinding the pilots at the critical moment. They had to stick their heads out of the cockpit and aim by eye, which threw off nearly every bomb. The results of the Tulagi strike were disappointing. Only the destroyer Kikuzuki was hit, and that by aerial torpedoes, not bombs. Of the 76 bombs dropped by the Yorktown squadrons, barely 11 struck anything at all. Birch admitted to Admiral Fletcher that the first strike had not done much good, but within an hour he was back in the air leading a second wave. Later that same day, a third strike was launched. The aviators were exhausted and the ships below threw up heavy anti-aircraft fire, but the experience hardened them. For the pilots of Scouting 5, it was a sobering lesson in the difficulty of hitting a maneuvering warship under combat conditions. Lieutenant Bernie Strong flew 3 strikes that day, and he considered the raid a success for the confidence it gave the squadron. Lieutenant Stanley Vetasa, flying his second hop of the day, tangled with a Japanese floatplane fighter that pressed him hard. The agile biplane was remarkably maneuverable, and it took several minutes of twisting combat before Vetasa finally set it on fire. His engine was hit and began leaking oil, and he struggled to make it back to the ship. Birch, his squadron commander, circled back to escort him home, flying wing on his crippled SBD until Vetasa caught the arresting wire. It was a small act of leadership that the young pilot would never forget. 3 days later, on the morning of May 7th, the American carriers finally found the main Japanese force. A scout pilot from Yorktown reported 2 carriers and 4 cruisers northwest of Rossel Island. Admirals Fletcher and Fitch launched everything they had. The Lexington Strike Group was first to arrive, and they found the light carrier Shoho steaming without air cover. Commander Bill Alt led the first SBDs down, scoring near misses. Then Lieutenant Commander Robert Dixon brought his scouting 2 division in from 18,000 feet. Ensign Jack Lepla, flying tail-end Charlie for his section, was attacked by Zeros as he pushed over, but he fired back with his forward guns and claimed 1 fighter destroyed. The Yorktown squadrons arrived minutes later. Birch led his scouting 5 SBDs down on the burning carrier. The bombing was devastating. Within 6 minutes, Shoho was a blazing wreck beginning to settle in the water. As the American planes circled the wreckage, Dixon transmitted the prearranged signal back to the task force. Scratch 1 flat up. It was the first Japanese carrier sunk by American forces in the war. The first day of the Coral Sea battle had been a victory, but the cost was not yet counted. The Japanese carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku remained undamaged, still steaming south with a full strike group. During the night, the American commanders prepared for the next day's fight. Lieutenant John Powers of Bombing 5, known to his friends as Jojo, told his roommate that he intended to press his dive all the way to the carrier deck to guarantee a hit. His determination would soon be tested beyond anything he could imagine. At dawn on May 8th, both sides launched search planes. A Lexington scout located the Japanese carriers at 0820, and the American strike groups were airborne by 0915. The Yorktown SBDs climbed through thick cloud layers, and at 10:32 they found the Shokaku and Zuikaku below them. The Japanese carriers were turning into the wind to launch their own strike. Birch held his formation for 17 minutes, waiting for the slower torpedo planes to catch up. As anti-aircraft fire began reaching for them, he gave the signal to attack. His division pushed over through heavy flak and swarming Zeros. John Powers was flying in the Bombing 5 division. As he started his dive, heavy anti-aircraft fire hit his plane, causing fuel leaks and fire. Wounded and flying a burning Dauntless, Powers did not pull out at the normal altitude. He continued his dive, passing through 2,000 feet, then 1,500, then 1,000. Other pilots watched his plane, engulfed in flames, plunging straight for the carrier. At 500 feet, far below the minimum safe release altitude, he released his 1,000-pound bomb. It struck Shokaku's flight deck just aft of the island, causing a massive explosion. Powers' dive bomber crashed into the sea a moment later, killing him and his gunner, Everett Hill. He would receive the Medal of Honor for that dive. The Yorktown SBDs damaged Shokaku severely, setting her flight deck on fire and forcing her to retreat. But the Japanese had already launched their own strike. 69 planes from Shokaku and Zuikaku were heading straight for the American carriers. Lieutenant Commander Birch, his SBD badly damaged with a shot-away rudder cable, limped back toward the task force, nursing his plane home with trim tabs alone. As the Zeros made their attacks, Glidewell fired back from the rear seat, claiming one fighter shot down and one probable. Birch managed a safe landing through sheer skill. But as he touched down, the battle was just beginning for the American ships. At 11:18, the Japanese torpedo planes hit the American task force. Yorktown dodged the torpedoes, but Lexington was not so lucky. Two Nakajima torpedoes struck the big carrier on her port side, causing tremendous explosions. Bombs followed, and within minutes, Lexington had taken two torpedoes and two bombs. Damage control parties rushed to contain the fires, but gasoline fumes from ruptured tanks began seeping through the ship. Meanwhile, the SBDs that had been held back for anti-torpedo plane patrol were ordered to intercept the incoming Japanese planes. They climbed to meet the enemy, but they were dive bombers pressed into service as fighters, and the Zeros were waiting for them. The losses among the SBDs were devastating. 4 planes from Scouting 5's anti-torpedo plane patrol went down in a single dogfight, killing 8 airmen. Ensign Sam Underhill, a Yale graduate and former Harvard Law student, was among the lost. Lieutenant William Hall of Scouting 2 claimed 2 torpedo planes shot down, but he was badly wounded in the foot and lost his hydraulics. He landed his crippled SBD on Lexington at excessive speed, ignoring the wave-off signal, and collapsed from blood loss as the deck crew pulled him from the cockpit. Other gunners, like John Liska and Albert Garlow, fired at the Zeros until their ammunition ran out, claiming kills but watching their friends fall. At 12:47, Lexington was rocked by a massive internal explosion. Gasoline fumes had ignited in the hangar deck, and fires began spreading uncontrollably. Captain Ted Sherman ordered the abandoned ship, and the crew slid down lines into the warm Coral Sea. Jack Lepla, who had fought through 2 days of intense combat and claimed multiple aerial victories, abandoned the burning carrier with nothing but the clothes on his back and his dog tag. The destroyer Phelps fired 5 torpedoes into Lady Lex at 1915, and she rolled over and sank at 1952. 216 men died with her, but the survivors were rescued. The Battle of the Coral Sea was over, and America had lost its first carrier of the war. Yorktown tied up in Nuku'alofa Harbor on May 15th. Her battle damage was patched, but the crews needed more than steel work. On the beach, Dixie Kiefer, the ship's executive officer, broke out a bottle of Four Roses bourbon for the Lexington survivors who had been taken aboard. It was a gesture of shared grief, not celebration. The men drank to absent friends, knowing the war was far from over. During June and July, the air groups were reorganized from the ground up. New squadrons were formed from the survivors, Scouting 10 and Bombing 10, built around the hardcore of men who had fought at the Coral Sea. They received fresh SBD Dauntlesses and a stream of replacement pilots straight from training. Birch was detached for staff duty in Washington and did not fly in the subsequent battles. The squadrons were ordered to the new carrier Enterprise, which had been repaired and was ready to return to the front. Many veterans were sent home for rest. Stanley Vetasa transferred to a fighter squadron and went on leave in the United States. Willard Glidewell was stationed at Pearl Harbor, waiting for his next assignment. Jack Lepla, still recovering from his ordeal, took medical leave in the States, but Lieutenant Bernie Strong was not granted that luxury. His orders came back to the South Pacific almost immediately, assigned to the newly formed Scouting 10 on Enterprise. He carried the weight of his earlier failure and the fierce words of Commander John Crommelin. The next battle would offer him a chance to redeem himself. August 7, 1942, the first wave of United States Marines hit the beaches of Guadalcanal and Tulagi. Overhead, the carrier air groups from Enterprise, Saratoga, and Wasp provided close support. Lieutenant Bernie Strong, flying from Enterprise with Scouting 10, pushed his SBD Dauntless into a dive against Japanese positions along the shoreline. His 1,000-pound bomb exploded among supply dumps and anti-aircraft emplacements, sending clouds of black smoke rolling across the jungle canopy. The landings were virtually unopposed, and by nightfall the Marines had secured the airfield on Guadalcanal. Strong carried a burden into this fight. Weeks earlier, he had aborted an attack on a Japanese carrier, drawing sharp criticism from his air officer, Commander John Crommelin. The word stung like a personal indictment. On Tulagi, the fighting was harder. The Marines faced entrenched Japanese defenders who fought from caves and coral ridges. SBDs from Saratoga and Enterprise were called in for close support, dropping their bombs within yards of American lines. The work was dangerous and imprecise, but the dive bombers broke up enemy strongpoints that infantry could not reach. By the end of the first week, both islands were in American hands. The Seabees set to work on the captured airfield, which they renamed Henderson Field. Within days, the first aircraft of the Cactus Air Force began arriving. Marine SBD squadrons flew in from Espiritu Santo, landing on the dusty, half-finished runway. They were joined by Navy dive bomber crews who had been stranded after the loss of the Lexington and the damage to the Yorktown at Coral Sea. These men, survivors of the earlier carrier battles, brought with them a hard-won knowledge of how to fight the Japanese. The life at Henderson Field was brutal. Daily Japanese air raids from Rabaul pounded the runway, and the jungle bred malaria and dysentery. Mechanics worked through the night to patch shrapnel holes in the SBDs. Pilots flew missions in the morning and fought off enemy attacks from the ground in the afternoon. The dauntless crews ran constant patrols against Japanese shipping in the slot, the channel between the Solomon Islands, attacking any vessel that moved by daylight. Ensign Leif Larson and his gunner, Dayton Harp, had their SBD riddled with bullet holes during a shipping strike off Santa Isabel Island. On their return to Henderson Field, the ground crew counted more than 50 holes in the wings and fuselage. The plane was patched and flying again within 48 hours. The Dauntless earned its reputation as a rugged aircraft, but the constant attrition wore down the men who flew them. On August 24th, the Japanese made their move. A large carrier force, built around the light carrier Ryujo, steamed south to challenge American control of the Solomons. Enterprise and Saratoga launched their strike groups. Strong, flying with Scouting 10, was among the first to locate the enemy fleet. He spotted Ryujo through a break in the clouds, her flight deck spotted with aircraft. He signaled his wingman and pushed over into his dive, but as he descended, his windshield fogged again, and his engine began to hesitate. The same sickening feeling returned. He struggled to keep the carrier in sight, but the oil-smeared glass and the vibration threw off his aim. At the last moment, he pulled out of the dive, aborting the attack. He led his wingman home under a cloud of shame. The task force had to rely on other SBDs to strike Ryujo that afternoon. Strong's bomb remained on its rack, and the memory of his abort would haunt him until his next chance to prove himself. Enterprise was not untouched. Japanese dive bombers from Shokaku and Zuikaku found her after the strike returned. 3 bombs struck the carrier, one through the forward flight deck and another near the island. Fires raged, but damage control parties contained them. Strong landed on the damaged flight deck as repair crews worked around him. He climbed from his cockpit, exhausted, and looked at the hole in the deck where he had parked. The ship was hurt, but still fighting. On the night of September 12th, the Japanese launched a major ground offensive against the Marine perimeter on Guadalcanal. The focus of the attack was a low, grassy ridge just south of Henderson Field. Thousands of Japanese infantry surged forward in waves, and the Marines, outnumbered and exhausted, called for air support. At dawn, the SBDs of the Cactus Air Force answered the call. The dive bombers worked in pairs, dropping fragmentation bombs and strafing the Japanese troops who had infiltrated the Marine lines. The pilots flew low, sometimes below 1,000 feet, to ensure their bombs landed close to the American defenders. The rear gunners fired their .30 caliber machine guns into the massed enemy formations, breaking up assaults before they could overrun the ridge. The fighting continued for 3 days, but the Marines held. By the end of September, the Cactus Air Force had lost half its aircraft to enemy action and operational accidents, but the dive bombers had done what was asked of them. They had supported the landings, struck Japanese shipping, and provided the close air support that kept the Marines alive on Edson's Ridge. On the flight deck of the damaged Enterprise, men like Strong knew the campaign was far from over. The next Japanese thrust would come from the carriers, and the dauntless crews would be ready. The night of October 25th, Commander John Crommelin gathered the Enterprise pilots in the wardroom and made the stakes plain. If the Japanese carriers broke through to Guadalcanal, he told them, the island would fall and the lifeline to Australia would be cut. Lieutenant Bernie Strong sat near the back, smoking a cigarette and drinking black coffee, knowing that Cromelin's words were aimed at him, a reminder of the failure that still stung. The next morning, at 14,000 feet, Strong spotted the carrier Zuiho emerging from under a layer of broken clouds. He signaled to his wingman, Ensign Charles Irvine, and pushed his Dauntless over into a near-vertical dive, the wind screaming past his open canopy. The carrier's flight deck grew in his telescopic sight, the big red circle painted on the teakwood, looking like a bullseye on a target. He held his aim through heavy anti-aircraft fire, released his 1,000-pound bomb at the right moment, and watched it tear into the flight deck. The plume of smoke and fire marked the hit, and Strong pulled out, knowing he had delivered. Commander Crommelin, watching from the Enterprise, would later recommend Strong for a second Navy Cross, adding to the one he already carried from his earlier actions in the Coral Sea, and the burden of his earlier failure was finally lifted. While Strong was diving on Zuiho, another veteran of the early battles was in the fight over the American task force. Lieutenant Junior Grade Stanley Vetasa had returned from leave in the United States and been assigned to Fighting Squadron 10 on the Enterprise, trading his Dauntless for the Grumman F-4F Wildcat. The Japanese strike that morning was the largest yet sent against an American carrier, with dive bombers and Zero fighters pressing in from all directions. Vetasa climbed to meet them, carrying the aggressive instincts he had learned during his time in Scouting 5. Vetasa threw his Wildcat into the kind of hard turns he had developed flying the Dauntless, cutting inside the enemy formations and using every ounce of speed to gain firing position. He shot down one Japanese plane, then another, then a third, each kill coming from a short, violent burst of his 650 caliber machine guns. By the time the fight was over, he had destroyed 7 enemy aircraft in a single day, becoming an ace in a day. The feat earned him the Navy Cross and a place in the record books as one of the Navy's top fighter pilots of the war. But the cost of the battle was severe. The carrier Hornet, the sister ship of the Enterprise, was hit repeatedly by Japanese bombs and torpedoes, her flight deck torn open and her engines dead in the water. The American air groups had damaged the carriers Zuiho and Shokaku, but the Hornet was lost, scuttled by her own escorting destroyers that night. Tactically, the Japanese had won the day. Strategically, however, they had failed, for the Marines on Guadalcanal still held Henderson Field, and the Japanese carriers had lost so many pilots that they could not risk another major engagement for months. 3 weeks later, in mid-November, the Japanese made another desperate attempt to dislodge the Marines. A powerful bombardment force of 2 battleships, a cruiser, and a screen of destroyers steamed down the slot toward Guadalcanal, intent on destroying Henderson Field with naval gunfire. The Enterprise, repaired and back at sea, launched her SBDs to join with the remaining aircraft of the Cactus Air Force. The dive bomber crews knew this was the last chance to stop the Japanese before their fleet reached the island. Willard Glidewell, who had been assigned to Scouting 10 on the Enterprise after his time at Pearl Harbor, climbed into the rear cockpit of a Dauntless as a gunner for the strike. The SBDs found the Japanese force north of Guadalcanal and pushed over from high altitude through a wall of anti-aircraft fire. From his rear seat, Glidewell watched the battleships grow in his sights, their decks churning with foam as they turned to evade. The first bombs missed, but the second wave found their mark, and black smoke began pouring from the lead battleship's turrets. The American dive bombers pressed home their attacks through the afternoon, crippling the battleship Hiei so badly that she was scuttled the next morning. The other battleship, Kirishima, was later sunk by American naval gunfire during the night surface engagement. The dive bombers had delivered a critical blow, but the final destruction came from the surface fleet. The Japanese bombardment force had been turned back, and the Marines on Guadalcanal would not face another serious naval threat. Control of the seas around the island had shifted to the Americans for good. By late November, the Guadalcanal campaign was effectively decided. The Japanese army had lost thousands of men to starvation, disease, and marine fire, and their navy could no longer risk its capital ships in the waters around the island. The surviving dive bomber crews of the Enterprise and the Cactus Air Force were rotated home, their combat tour complete. They had flown through months of constant danger, from the first strikes at Tulagi to the carrier battles of Coral Sea and Santa Cruz, and they had helped secure the first American offensive victory of the war. For their actions, many of the airmen received the Navy Cross, the Navy's highest award for valor after the Medal of Honor. Strong was among them, his dive on Zuiho a fitting answer to the doubts he had carried since his earlier failure. Glidewell, the veteran gunner who had shot down 3 Zeros at Coral Sea and flown through the battles of Santa Cruz and the naval battle of Guadalcanal, also received the Navy Cross. Vetasa was awarded his own Navy Cross for the 7 kills he had scored in a single day over Santa Cruz. Strong remained in the Navy after the war and retired as a captain, his early mistake long since forgiven in the shadow of his combat record. Vetasa also stayed in the service, retiring as a captain after a career that included command of a fighter squadron. Glidewell left the Navy and returned to civilian life, his 12 years of service earning him a place among the most decorated enlisted airmen of the Pacific War. Jack Lepla survived the war and returned to civilian life in Ohio. William Hall recovered from his wounds and continued his naval career, retiring as a commander. Robert Dixon, the skipper of Scouting II, served through the war and retired from the Navy in 1946. John Liska completed his combat service and returned home to California, where he worked in the aerospace industry. Charles Irvine, Strong's wingman at Santa Cruz, also survived the war and remained in the Navy for a full career. The records are silent on the later years of some of the others, but the legacy of what they did together in the dark months of the Guadalcanal campaign endures. The dive bomber crews who fought at Santa Cruz and Guadalcanal did not think of themselves as heroes. They were young men from farms and small towns who had learned to fly and found themselves in the middle of the greatest war the world had ever seen. They flew their Dauntlesses into anti-aircraft fire and fighter attacks because the Marines on the ground needed them, and because the alternative was losing the Pacific. That is the measure of what they did, and it is worth remembering. If you have any family stories or memories from the Guadalcanal campaign or the Pacific War, we would love to hear them in the comments below. We read every one of them and appreciate the history you share with us. If you enjoyed this documentary, please subscribe to the channel and give the video a like to support our work. Thank you for listening and for keeping the memory of these airmen alive.